除了参加我们今天的这个学术座谈会啊，我也希望下午大家有空了有那个抽空可以去看看这个精彩的展览。那后人类欲望是我们今年跨年度的，也是年底压轴的一个大展。那这一次我们邀请了留英的陈明慧博士担任策展人，然后加上我们原来的副馆长林礼杰女士做协同策展人，两个人学术加上实务的一个配合这一个这个展览呈现，好像大家应该会很满意。当然，我们还是希望大家给我们多多指教。那每一次配合我们的比较那个主题展呢，我们都会安排一个连续2天左右的这样一个学术座谈活动这一次也很难得，我们在现场大家会看到有很多这一次参展的艺术家都来到台北现场。那今天的研讨会一开始我们会从比较学术的一个角度来切入，然后呢接下来呢今天连续2天呢这次参展艺术家也都会来跟大家分享他们的创作心得，还有他们参展的作品一些理念那这有限的一个空间，大家可以感受到，我想各位参加过很多研讨会，很多馆所都有这个国际会议厅很棒的一个场所。当代馆就是一个古迹，就这么一个小小的很亲切当然有一点拥挤的空间，但是我希望大家感觉就是比较跟这个讲者有比较短的距离，比较亲切一点。那今天早上因为我们的中间的这个休息时间比较短，所以我们大概只有简单的茶点。但下午中间他们有一个这休息期间会有大家有一些茶点可以吃喝这样。那希望大家能够 enjoy 享受你在当代馆这一天的这样的一个学术的一个活动。那这个今天我先介绍我们的这个策展人陈明慧博士，接下来我们就准备就请他先针对这个展览就做一个跟大家做一个分享这样好。
I think I'm just going to sit down. Since we have quite a lot of international artists and scholars here, I'm just going to, and this is an academic conference, so I'm going to speak in English, I'm afraid. Right. The curation of the post-humanist design exhibition can be traced back to my other projects, 0 and 1, Cyberspace and Myth of Gender, held in Chongqing in China in 2010. During this show, I started to employ the concept of digitality and sexuality in curatorial projects. My long-term research interest in physical and cultural hybridization has also embedded in the curatorial concepts of the post-humanist design projects. Consequently, I thought of the term post-human, which in my view covers the diverse and complicated themes related to digital culture, sexuality, and hybridity. All of which form the fundamental theoretical consideration behind the curating of this show, Post-Humanist Desire. The term post-human comes from Post-Human Manifesto by Steve Nichols, published in 1988. Although the definition of post-human remains undecided within academic and artistic fields, the term has become very common in describing the diversion and complex life expectations and identities in the 21st century. The content and structure of this exhibition responds to the feminist philosopher Donna Haraway's reflections on digital technology and the artificial intelligence of the early 1990s. She extended the meaning of the cyborg, a neologism and concept first seen in the 1960s, to include the combination of both organic and artificial life, in which humans seek new ways to break the boundaries between nature and culture. In fact, people today do not adhere to any single value, but live in varied heterogeneous and inconsistent systems. The state of the post-human is somewhere between the human and the non-human, demonstrating a sense of uneasiness and uncertainty. It manifests a kind of imagination derived from a combination of the human body and technology. Haraway asserts that a cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. The post-human cyborg exists beyond the real material world, where it does not carry specific symbols of gender. Thus, it challenges the normalized ideology of sexuality. This exhibition interrogates the deconstruction and re-examination of the understanding of sexuality via digital media, including digital print, video, multimedia installation, and sculptural pieces. With specifically selected contemporary artworks, the show visualizes the complex conditions of the post-human and its relation to the issue of gender and hybridization. The three categories of this exhibition present the consolidation of the diverse conditions of post-human and even touch upon ancient and current mythical tales. A group of 25 artists have been invited to participate and show their works in the exhibition and to help interpret it, the continuously developing theme of the post-human. Those categories are under three headings: the clone human, the transgendered human, and the transformed human. The first category is clone human. Cloning in biological science refers to the process of producing genetically identical animals in an asexual way. The success of cloning Dolly the sheep in 1996 demonstrated the fact that the development of biotechnology has the potential to produce animals essentially in a lab. The post-human clone refers to a hybrid of human and animals which is created based on artistic imaginations, while it is also related to the discourse of androgyny and asexuality in contemporary art. The second category is the transgender human. This category challenges the convention of the traditional dual division of gender, for example, male and female. It covers issues of transsexualism, transvestitism, homosexuality, and bisexuality, all of which are still controversial in many societies and some specific cultures. It questions the norms of socially constructed gender and the dualism of sexuality. The third category is the transformed human. The post-human body is a cyborg. The cyborg is either an organic hybridized body somewhere between human and other creatures, or a non-organic mechanized body, which is a combination of a human and technology. A cyborg could be virtual and non-physical, only existing on the internet, or it could also be physically presented via mixed media. In this exhibition, it's my great pleasure to invite 25 artists to show their wonderful works at the prestigious Museum of Contemporary Art, Taipei. Their works are the essential and indispensable part of this project and offer a rare opportunity for the audiences in Taiwan and beyond to enjoy the beauty and the strength of their imagination towards posthumanism. Right, this is my part, and now I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Marsha Meskimen from the UK. Right. She's actually my PhD supervisor in the UK back, when was it, 10 years ago, a while ago in the UK. Right, Professor Marsha Meskimen is Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art History and Theory in Loughborough University. His research is centered on the work of human artists and on the development of new theoretical perspectives on ethics and subjectivity in contemporary global art practices. She has published books, articles in many She has published several books, including The Art of Reflection, Women Artists' Self-Portraiture in the 20th Century, We Weren't Modern Enough, Women Artists and the Limits of German Modernism, The Women Making Art, History, Subjectivity, Aesthetics. Her most recent book, Contemporary Art and the Cosmopolitan Imagination, explores the dynamics of belonging or being at home in contemporary transnational art. So let's welcome her for the, I'm sure, will be very wonderful keynote speech.
Right. Good morning. Before I begin, I want to congratulate the director of Mokka Taipei for hosting a fabulous show. This is a tremendous show, and you should be much congratulated for putting in the effort and supporting it in such a way. I'd also like to congratulate both the curator, Dr. Ming Turner, and the co-curator, Yu Chi Lin, for a timely interaction into an important area of art making and discourse. I'd especially like to thank Ming for the invitation to deliver this opening keynote, and I'm very delighted to be here. And as she has already alluded to, she was in fact my doctoral student many years ago, and she has been a great success, and we're very proud of her in Loughborough, and her success is here as well. So congratulations, Ming, on the show. I'm going to deliver an opening keynote which does refer to some of the work in this show, but it does not speak over the many artists who will present over the next 2 days, and I'm quite thrilled to be able to hear them myself as well following this. I'm hoping I'm audible. Am I audible? Okay, because I'm going to leave this. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Those words are Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley from Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus from 1818. And they're the moment when Dr. Frankenstein has brought the creature to life, the creature that he has endeavored for 2 years to bring to life. Frankenstein, we call this, Frankenstein's monster. It is in fact a nameless creature, and that's quite significant. And he is filled with disgust. He has longed to produce this animate, inanimate creature. When it's there, he cannot love it. He cannot desire it. His desire turns instead to horror and disgust. Nearly 2 centuries ago, therefore, Mary Shelley wrote the novel Frankenstein, a tragic tale of human endeavor gone wrong. The scientist Victor Frankenstein seeks to make life, but is repelled by the monster, the nameless and unloved being he creates. The monster is not intrinsically evil, but the brutal rejection he receives, first from Frankenstein, at that moment, in fact, and later from other humans throughout the tale. He attempts to connect to humans, and it never happens. He's repulsed. Turns him to the monster that he becomes known as. The monster he becomes is the monster he appears. The tragedy of this Promethean tale is in part a failure of desire, or as I will argue through this, it is a failure to attain a post-humanist desire. The desire remains within the logic of humanism, and therefore the monster, which can never attain human nature, is always rendered other and kept away. However, on a lighter note, monsters are back in fashion. From t-shirts and Lego, and I know this Lego oh so well. My son loves Monster Lego, Monster Fighter Lego. To video games, TV shows, animated films, we are surrounded by Frankenstein's monster, vampires, and zombies. The dead, reanimated, and the undead are still the stuff of contemporary dreams and nightmares. But if humanism, as epitomized by the overreaching scientific knowledge of the modern Prometheus, Victor Frankenstein, could not endure the possibilities of monsters, then the question raised for us, I would suggest, is can a post-humanist perspective enable us to open ourselves more generously to the desires engendered by a vital matter that does not need human agency as its center? And of course, the other question, can art provide a space in which to pose this question and explore some possible answers? In 1998, and subsequently in a number of other works, the Thai artist Araya Rasjamrayansuk produced a single-channel video known as Reading a Now for a Female Corpse. And I show you an image from that, a still from that. The artist is seated in this work in the Chiang Mai Hospital morgue in Thailand. She recites verses from the classical Thai text, the Inao, over the body of a young, unnamed, unclaimed, dead woman. Much like the unnamed and unnameable, unclaimable body of Frankenstein's monster, the dead woman residing in the morgue has no one to recite to her death, has no one to carry her safely across. She is undesired, she is potentially monstered. In Razjam Reontsuk's work, the text of desire, the artist's desire, the potential for female desiring subjectivity is brought back through a lament, through the song or the incantation over the woman's body. The Inao is not a traditional funereal lament, but rather it is a story of woman's desire. It is a story of actually of kingship and a king who is desired by a range of women. It's an import from Malay into Thailand, but it became a pivotal Thai classical text, so it is not a usual lament. But it recognizes desire, it recognizes female subjectivity, and it recognizes in the singing of this lament over the unnamed, undesired body, this woman who has died, this woman who is lost and not otherwise claimed. The abject object, which otherwise is the monster to our humanist endeavor, is revealed, surveyed, and reclaimed through this lamentation. We sit, when we watch this installation, we sit in the same position as the artist. We sit in a darkened space and hear through the technology the lament. We never survey the body. The body is never uncovered. The body is never looked at. The body is never dissected. It's never given to us as an object in that way. Rather, we are given the singing the desiring embodied female corpse back into recognition. Now, there's much to say about this work in a range of ways, but suffice it to say here that the resonant act of female lamentation operates as a post-humanist desire to reclaim the monstered creature. It is, in fact, my contention, therefore, that art can provide a space in which to pose the question of the post-human desire and to explore some possible answers to what it might actually bring to us. And I'm suggesting there are sort of three general areas around this. And I'll move through that. One. Contemporary science confounds easy boundaries between forms of matter: animal, vegetable, mineral, cyborg, the living, and the dead. At the level of the atom and the genome, the matter of the human is not radically distinct from the matter of the non-human. Indeed, if the figuration of the latter half of the 20th century was the atom, the notion of an atomic universe, the notion that we could understand the world as somehow a matter of attractions and repulsions, a matter of fundamental units, monadic units of intelligibility, the engendering of biogenetics, bioethics, and genopolitics have made the gene or the genome a popular cultural signifier for understanding bodies, societies, and power in the present. These conceptions, the post-human conceptions of the genome, suggest that our composite forms are no more nor less vital than those by which we are surrounded and into which we enter into constant and significant exchange. These exchanges are not limited to human interaction, but include exchanges between humans and living non-humans, between humans and non-living forms. They exist across dimensions, they exist across concepts, they exist across a sphere of vital matter. The most ubiquitous signifier of the exchanges of these types relate to the extension of the human through machines or technologies, whether these are prosthetic, integral, or virtual. The cipher for these is the cyborg. We come to know that. But the cyborg is a very extensive metaphor, and it includes, for example, the fact that I'm wearing glasses. I am sitting here as a cyborg. It is absolutely localized. I didn't used to have to wear them, so I have become a cyborg. Nevertheless, the cyborg is commonplace. The cyborg is actually with us, and yet it still remains a rather distanced figure, and we don't think through it in a regular way. The cyborg, however, I'm arguing, is not a strange science fiction figure or an anthropomorphic robot, but the very cipher of human becoming, the recognition of the dispersal of our agency in, of, and through our connections with other subjects and objects in the world, and the extension of those to include the non-human. Arguably, what is at stake in exploring cyborgs as more than sci-fi toys is precisely the opportunity to find forms by which to express a post-human desire that can encompass our material becomings. What is interesting to me about the notion of that is that it may entail an expansion of our understanding of ourselves as human, and a corollary repositioning of our human being as human becoming, as a state of flux, a continual process of connection and reconnection across the boundaries of animate and inanimate matter. Such a reconception of human becoming reconceives the notion of life itself. Or, as Rosie Braidotti has argued, such a thinking sees the emergence of Zoe in the field of bios. And Braidotti, I think, is instructive in relation to this. Are we not baffled by this scandal, this wonder, this Zoe? That is to say, by an idea of life that exuberantly exceeds bios and supremely ignores logos. The notion of reintroducing, we have tended to have, particularly in a Western concept of life force, a very bios-oriented one. That is to say that life is understood as being intrinsic to organisms. And so life is understood as existing while the organism exists and extinguishing when the organism ceases to exist. But Zoe is life force. Zoe goes beyond that. And so by thinking of a bios-Zoe compound, the bios-Zoe compound refers to what was previously known as life by introducing a differentiation internal to this category. This allows for a non-binary way of positioning the relationship between same and other, between different categories of living beings, and ultimately between life and death. What Braidotti is arguing in rethinking life as being Zoe bios, as being this kind of fundamental mutuality and connection, is to tap into Zoe as absolutely beyond a humanist understanding of life, in which life ends when the I or the you, the human being or the ego, dies. But rather, Zoe is beyond us all. And this beyond us is terrifying, awe-inspiring, the wonder and the awe of it, so on and so forth. But it is also extremely powerful. It allows us to reconceive death. It allows us to reconceive our relationships to death as merely another form of becoming. Life's force becoming also unbecomes. It also becomes toward extinction. And it also allows us to see life and our participation, and see us not as owning life or containing life or being life, but rather as participating in a much broader sphere, which is life. And therefore our empowerment through that is through conglomerations, through connections with others and other forms of living and life. Artwork engaging in this territory, anything that connects with this notion of Zoe and bios, has the potential to not surrender itself easily to fixed subject-object divisions, and also to transgress social norms of behavior, not least in relation to illness, death, or our interrelationships with non-human animals. It reconceives our relationships to what is alive, what is dead, to the living, the non-living, the extension of the human. And that Zoe bios is one of the areas that I'm interested in relation to a post-humanist desire. The other is quite straightforward, the second. The recalcitrance of the flesh, which is both disarming and desirable. Our skin surfaces, our fleshly bodies, both separate us in our difference and provide us the most luxurious of our desiring contact. The joyous Zoe, our body-to-body relationships. Participation in life itself is a becoming in connection with others. It is not the realization of a singular, transcendent, isolated human position, but rather a knowledge that we have at our fingertips, literally, at the surfaces of our skin, the possibility to engage in the beauty of our recalcitrant flesh, but also its connectivity. Our bodies persist despite the rhetoric of virtual avatars and digital sex, serving to locate and implicate us in our desires and our discourses. Whatever post-human desire might describe, it cannot negate the lingering presence of our enfleshed materialization. Our primary experience of matter is and is through our bodies. Our bodies don't disappear no matter what guise we take, no matter what we undertake to do in relation to their connections. They persist, they exist, and they enflesh us. However, our embodiment, or indeed the notion of embodied subjectivity, does not prescribe our agency. It doesn't limit human agency. Rather, human agency expands to be understood in its extension. In this sense, it does not fix a singular notion of desire, sexual or otherwise, upon human agents. Rather, it relishes the potential of bodies, their capacities and powers, as mutable and multiple. The desiring agency of the embodied subject is an extensive combination of the erotic, the poetic, and the aesthetic, not limited to specific sexual identification or acts. Rather, much the way that Audre Lorde talked about the erotic is a notion of power. The erotic is a notion of what it means to have agency. It is not necessarily a definition of a sexuality or a sexual identity. It moves beyond that to the articulation of ourselves through aesthetics, through poetics, and through excessive multiplicity. Moving beyond singular definition or containment, embodiment, and desire can be engaged, but never caged. Embodied subjectivity in a post-humanist conception of matter, therefore, encompasses the collaborative articulation of desire in the very making of artworks, and as a consequence, has radical implications for the constitutions of human subjects. In this sense, it suggests that humans are but one form of corporeal presence amongst any number of variations of corporeality. It also suggests and posits the possibility of the agency of artwork. The flesh resists categorization and fixity, even as it more fully participates in its matter as a mode of materialization in a post-humanist conception of desire as a transformative state. The connection between vital matter and subjectivity suggests the possibility of an ecology of desire beyond the conventional divisions of subject and object, human and non-human. We've been looking at this in relation to the idea of the transcendence of the human as the central figure for life itself, the central cipher of this. We've looked at this in relation to the recalcitrance of flesh as embodiment, and I want to move to the idea and expand the idea of an ecology of desire specifically. In this sense, desire becomes a vital force through which agency might manifest itself in multiple interconnections, in ecologies consisting of combinations of materials and forces in space and over time. This notion is not an ecology in an eco-activist or specifically ecological or environmental sort of sense. It is rather the notion that the purview of the individual human subject is a motivating force that combines and recombines objects, subjects, images, ideas, matters, and concepts in what might almost be termed a viral ecology, in what might actually look at the way in which we interact on a constant and regular level with all elements of the activities and forces around us. The ecological forms of desire that are beyond an eco-activist approach to the world still describe the different ways of living, of belonging to a world understood as connected with humans rather than subject to them. We live in amidst the vitality of matter, making, remaking, being made, in its flow. Yet these ways of living, these ways of belonging to the world, are merely emergent. Humans still dominate the globe and still persist in economies of exchange premised upon their privileged subject positions. We still envisage ourselves rather than parts of an ecology. We still see ourselves as in control of an ecology, able to effect or implement ecological change and so forth. We still place ourselves in a dominant world position. We still feel able to control, contain, and pronounce upon the phenomena of which we are actually a part, and in many respects an insignificant part. However, emergent forms of thought and new figurations for identity toward a post-human desire can be fostered, trialed in, and expressed through artworks. Artworks permit an imaginative space to open in which the organic meets the inorganic, the living meets the dead, and forms of difference are arranged as productive variations rather than deadly opposites. Within such a realm, the self can be repositioned, the body reviewed, the matter in the world reconfigured, such that enchantment and wonder might suggest more generous and connected ways to live. We might be able to welcome these new, strange, and yet compelling forms. We might find ourselves in a position to engage bodily with that which we first find strange and which later we find connected, beautiful, enchanting. And in this way, we turn to a very particular dimension, and the dimension on which ultimately I wish to finish today, and that is the affective implications of an aesthetic articulation of vital matter and post-humanist desire and subjectivity. The affective implications of this, I would suggest, don't reside. A humanist notion of desire, the desire which failed so miserably in the Promethean task of producing Frankenstein's monster, of reanimating life, centered in that way, failed because of the notion, in its affective dimension, it failed at the moment of awe. Frankenstein was awed by his monster. He was shocked. He was rendered disgusted. He was filled with horror. He was overwhelmed by its difference, by its deadliness, by its inability to speak to him as a human. Sometimes people conceive awe as very akin to wonder, but in fact, in terms of their origins and in the way in which they've developed as concepts, they actually have a very particular and subtle difference between them. And that is that wonder is not, like awe, overwhelming. Wonder is also something that is experienced as an affective state in the condition of experiencing difference. So absolute difference also expresses itself through a notion of our wondering in relation to it. But wondering is a very different kind of emotion. It compels engagement. It compels experience. I'm looking at this particular work in relation to it, in relation to the way in which Elizabeth King also noted in a book in which she used this work, Pupil, something that she called attention's loop. She did not refer to this as a notion of wonder, but she described a form of attention that occurs in the making of this small object which in certain respects resembles Frankenstein's monster. It's a small object called Pupil, which is on one hand an incredibly lifelike self-portrait image, but on the other hand is demonstrably not human, explicitly, absolutely machinic. It is half life-size, yet it gestures, it renders remarkable facial qualities, and it can be used to articulate any number of physical expressions. And it is articulated in relation to the artist's hands in its making, but also in relation to its own gestures and its movement, and in relation to a range of images and animations, in fact, in which it produces tiny little descriptive gestures which are remarkably kinesthetic. That is to say, it is almost impossible to understand the nature of what it is you're engaging with and looking at unless you also understand what it means to do that. And this, for example, comes along, this particular image comes with a story in which Elizabeth King renders fictively an imaginative moment in which her father, who is a physicist, attempts to understand a certain kind of crystal, and he talks about this crystal being so fragile that were you to even hold it between your fingers, you would destroy the molecular units of this crystal. So you have a story which gives to you a kinesthetic physical experience and an object which asks you to engage in that. It produces what King describes, therefore, as attention's loop. My argument would be that that form of modular attention, that form of attending to the object to position it in such a way that it then attends to the subjects who see it kinesthetically so that they are able to step into that positioning, which then loops back into the understanding and the making of the object, that generates the affective state of wonder. We experience this absolutely different object, this object which is not human at all, but we engage with it through a compelling affective engagement of attention, of an attention that actually expresses a wonder. The hands, the gesture, the compelling affect. We are not overwhelmed. We are not given awe through this object. This is not Frankenstein's monster moving us away. It is precisely engaging us across difference with the vital matter of something which is utterly inanimate and yet engaged with us. And so we return through that gesture, through that attention's loop, to where we began. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. Frankenstein had desired this connection, but he was limited by his human nature, by his Promethean humanism, constraining his ability to engage in a post-human desire. Victor Frankenstein's revulsion at his idea-made flesh monster is tragic in the strong sense of the term. It is an excruciatingly painful loss, and at the same time, an inevitability. The arch-humanist could not extend his desire to include the monsters in human flesh, however much the creature longed for this inclusion. Frankenstein could not extend his understanding or empathy, or indeed wonder, toward the creature he had made. Such a kiss of death was beyond his reach. What I am suggesting here is that perhaps it is not any longer beyond ours. Thank you very much.
Marsha Meskimen for the very detailed research in most of artists' works in this show, and I've learned a lot, and I feel that it's wonderful to see the blur, like the boundary between the living and the dead, and the creature and the non-creature. Right. I think I should open the time to the floor. So I wonder if anyone has any questions regarding the talk, or any thoughts or any feedback that you like to propose. Yes. This is Professor Anna Munster.
Hi, Anna. Hi, Anna.
So thanks for a great talk. So my question, I'm just thinking out loud and on my feet, is that what's interesting for me is the work you've chosen to take us on a journey around wonder is a work that was made in 1991 using very traditional methods of image production. And actually for me also, that it's one of the works in the show that strikes me straight away and had a very affective force for me. And I'm really very grateful for you for explaining those kinds of relationships. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the relationship of older media techniques, particularly stop motion animation, which is, of course, making a huge comeback, particularly among younger artists everywhere, Asia, Europe, Australia. And there is a really very strong engagement with those sorts of techniques at a time when, of course, mainstream image making is about not finding those gaps, not finding that seamlessness. So I'm just wondering if there's anything you wanted to say there about those kinds of techniques.
Thank you for your question, and in a way, I think you've already very articulately and very eloquently positioned it. You've talked about the return to the analog, and it's occurring a lot. And you're absolutely right. It's massive. It's massive among my students, and it's clearly signifying something. And I think the thing that you mentioned about the notion of a break or a fissure or a lack of seamlessness seems to be, to a great extent, one of the appeals, that precisely you get a chance to have a moment to look at something. But I also had a photographer who has returned to the analog explain to me something that I found very enlightening, where she said that she was returning to these old formats, and they're quite very, very old formats. I mean, they're kind of looking again at notions of daguerreotypes. I mean, it's really old photography. But she was saying that what she had lost in the digital, or though she felt that she had begun to lose in the digital, was a slowness of looking. And what she was hoping, and one of the things that she was looking at and regaining, was the chance to look more slowly herself, that she had become accustomed to basically shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting, and then often going back and finding the image and then doing what she wanted to it. But with these other forms, because they are so slow to produce and you have to be so precise, and they're so one-off in their production, you look and look and look and frame and look again, and so forth. And that slowing down of production allows her to engage much more richly with the nature of what she's producing. I mean, I think that's encapsulating one of the things that I'm interested in relation to, and I'm interested in this concept of wonder in a very big sort of way, actually in a very politicized way as well, very highly politicized way. I think it has a lot to say about a certain kind of engagement with otherness and difference, which does not either consume it, assimilate it, or stand in repulsion and push it away. I think it's the one possibility we have for coming across something which is utterly different and yet engaging. So I'm interested in the affective states and in dissecting that in quite a careful way. But this question of being able to have a modulation and a slowness and an attentiveness to our experience of difference is quite critical to it. So if that is an element of the return to the analog. But again, I'd open the floor to the many artists who are here. There are a range of people who use a range of different techniques, and clearly this is happening now. And it would be very interesting to know if anybody else feels that that some of these returns are intending to regain or reclaim certain kinds of affective experience that has been lost in a seamlessness of the digital.
There's from Goldsmith College in London.
Hi. My question is also to do with the making process, the process of the artist. I'm really interested in your model of Frankenstein's monster. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about desire in that process, how desire plays a role in making art.
I think I'd say two things. One is the classic thing that I need to say, which is that I think desire plays a role in making anything that is creative, whether one would call that art or not. And so it's a very broad base, and art would be one of the manifestations of that. But it would be in making theory and making your life and making a range of possible things that one might consider to be much kind of much to do with what it is to exist as a desiring alive creature. I think what's interesting to me about this notion of desire is to extend it past, and what's interesting about the post-human about in the concept of desire, are to extend them past an idea of making where we are transcendent, where the maker is somehow transcendent and stands outside the things that are made. So Frankenstein's Desire, I mean, it's a fantastic book, actually, and if you actually bother to read Mary Shelley, as opposed to all the kind of, we get it so mediated through so many systems, but if you go back to Mary Shelley's volume, it's fantastically beautifully written and very interesting, and often written through letters, it's epistolary, and it's really interesting. And but the desire that Frankenstein has is unbelievably intense. It's all-consuming. He's sort of that stops to eating. His friends are all worried about him. They think he's going to be insane, you know, because he's making this thing, and the whole dedication of his existence. But it's the notion of the Promethean part of the tale, is that he thinks he's outside the things that he's making. He's going to create life because he's bigger than life. And of course, this thing that he creates completely confounds that. And so it's this, and then the whole rest of the book is, of course, him attempting to get rid of it and having it doing all these awful things, and him knowing he's responsible for them. And so all these various kinds of things until he's utterly consumed at the end, and the monster is off in the Arctic, and you know, it's very bizarre. And but that kind of desire is the desire to be outside the thing made. And I'm more interested in models of art practices, or models of work where you assume that there is a modulation, and the artist is as much made as making. So that the desire for the process is that you are changed in the making of the process. Every time you iterate or articulate, you are also altered. So you are not standing outside saying, I'm now going to make my masterpiece, and there it is, oh, there's my masterpiece. But rather, I'm engaged in a process of inquiry, and I make, and it makes me, and I make, and it makes me, and it goes back and forth. And I think that is a much more extensive notion of what it is to have agency, that is aesthetic agency, poetic agency, creative agency, desiring agency. I hope that answered that.
And our Protestant artist in the show.
Hello. Thank you for a wonderful thought. I just had some comment about Frankenstein and also the cyber organism, because in a way you can also consider, I mean, Frankenstein as you know, like the ultimate desire, you know, something which is something about the undead, or something that has a desire that it's not maybe a human desire. It's just a desire that that persists as a desire itself. Something that cannot, like the monster. Its only desire is to consume something. You know, like to eat as much as it can or kill as much as it can. It's like. And I find that also interesting in the way of thinking of the new human or the cyber human as also something that transcends death, you know, that transcends life itself. Mm-hmm. So, could you say something about that?
Yeah, I think that's very illuminating, and actually I'm really glad you posited the notion of the monster's desire, because I've left that out in a sense, and it's actually a really interesting one. The classical model of that would be very much that Frankenstein, the Dr. Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, resides within the level of bios. So his desire is a human desire, and it operates, and it can fail, and it tries to be transcendent. Whereas the monster precisely figures a post-human Zoe, life itself. It simply exists to exist, and it continues to exist, and the force simply exists through it, and its desire is simply to continue to exist. Nothing but that. It isn't for something in a teleological sense that would understand its beginning and its end, because it doesn't follow the path of having a beginning in that sense. It also doesn't follow the automatic path and assumption of the end of the ego. So the ego exists as nothing but the force of life itself. So yes, I think the parallel you could draw between, or the basically, or the differentiation you could draw between Victor Frankenstein and the monster is precisely that limited notion of a humanist desire which resides within the bios, as opposed to life force, which is absolutely extensive. And of course, in that tale, turns to horror. It's too awful. It's too much awe because it's too great. It's too beyond understanding. It won't be limited, and so it's shocking. But I think it's very recuperable, and I think actually it's also a remarkable tale in as much as the monster is I think an incredibly sympathetic figure in rereading now, and wasn't as much at the moment it was written, was much more a force and a terror, an outside, and now I think is a very different figure. But I appreciate your bringing him back in, because I think that's critical to this, actually.
I'd just like to make a comment further to that. For me, one of the key forces that motivates Frankenstein is the monster's desire to be desired, because the monster awakes and it wants Frankenstein's love, and he refuses to give it, and then the monster escapes. But then he returns and says, well, if you won't love me, make me someone who will love me. And so ultimately the tragedy of Frankenstein turns on his refusal to allow the monster to be loved. The monster just wants someone to connect with it. And it tries to find it amongst humanity, and humanity fails it miserably.
Yeah. No, I totally agree, and I think I agree, and the scenes and the part of it where Frankenstein refuses, it kind of begins the process of making the female character for the monster, and then like destroys it, is really quite shocking and quite horrible. And it is precisely that. It's no, you don't operate within my terms, and I actually want to destroy you. I won't allow for there to be a conglomerate, multiple, beyond the human sort of sense of desire, love, affection, nothing. I won't allow it. Yeah, potentially procreation. Yeah, exactly. Potentially, or another sort of form of generation, which would be the more frightening, outside the control. Exactly. So I think you're absolutely right. There's that as well. I mean, I think it's a fantastic and really interesting tale in relation to this whole question of what it might mean to talk about post-humanist reconfiguration and conglomeration, and the idea that we aren't separate entities that are perfectly formed within ourselves, but actually are potentially unbelievably extensive and potentially not at all important in that way. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Saya Wolfalk. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was really great. So something I'm trying to wrap my head around with this idea of post-humanism, and one of the things that I was really excited about participating in this show was that there seems to be room in this somewhere for a not only interspecies forms of hybridization or like animate, inanimate, but also for kind of intercultural, interethnic, international, global, like cosmopolitanism. And I'm wondering if you can kind of unpack that a bit for us here, because it would be great to, I mean, that was very exciting to me as a possibility, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think funnily enough, those would be my first thoughts about it, really. We've ended up talking more about the living and the dead, and the animate and inanimate and kind of machinic. But in fact, what I think is most exciting about the whole notion of the extension toward a post-humanist conception of kind of ethics and ecologies are precisely that they operate in a much more immediate sense. We don't have to project ourselves as being elaborated by machines. We can actually start suggesting instead that we have a way of understanding ourselves as being connected across the world, culturally, interculturally, through all sorts of forms of difference, which we don't have to necessarily see as either something that has to be understood and assimilated and made homogeneous, nor do we need to be frightened of, in a sense. And so I'm quite interested in the idea of acknowledging difference without having to force it into an economy of the same. And I think that's precisely one of the extensive notions of a certain kind of post-humanist desire. I mean, I go back a step, I guess, in terms of unpacking it, which is that from my perspective, and I'm in accord with people like Brodati or Elizabeth Gross in relation to this, and a few other people like Jane Bennett looking at vital matter, in the sense that it comes from having a specific feminist commitment to an idea of a non-binary, non-dualist subjectivity, which would be understood as an embodied subject who is also situated and therefore is responsible for to others and with others. So it is a notion of a generous corporeal subjectivity, which is not monadic and transcendent, but is actually very precise and located within a certain kind of enworlded worldview. And in that sort of sense, I think quite a lot flows from that in terms of an ethics of posthumanism. And I don't think that they're an ethics of radical relativism or any of those sorts of things at all. I think it's far more specific that you understand yourself not to be able to exist without others, human and non-human, and therefore have a responsibility toward producing ecologies of generosity that will enable all of those others to continue to exist, etc., etc. So there is precisely an intercultural, intersubjective understanding of human becoming and being, rather than an idea of there being any kind of a sense of autonomy. It's a generous and interconnected subject position. It therefore lends itself precisely to a cosmopolitan project and so forth. So yes, the demonstrable politics and the demonstrable kind of effects of this, and I think some of the things that you can see in relation to thinking through the post-human in the imaginative practices and creative practices of art are precisely that it allows for the potential to have some really interesting cross-cultural dialogue and engagement, and is I think quite powerful for that.
Hello. Hi again. Again, thank you very much for the talk. You talked a little bit about the idea of the cyborg, or the augmented human, and our inability to recognise that, in fact, many of us, in a way, are cyborgs, in a sense. With the advent of always-on technologies such as Google Glass and that kind of thing, do you think we're approaching some kind of tipping point where we might actually realise that we are becoming a post-human society?
That's quite an interesting idea. I don't have an answer to this. I have a speculation, though, and maybe we are getting to a tipping point where we'll recognize that. I think that question's too big for me. I think my sort of sense would be we might be getting to a tipping point where we recognize our interdependence upon such things in a really pedestrian way, and that fundamentally begins to shift the way in which we orient ourselves. So I'm not sure we're all going to hit the moment of saying, wow, we're post-human, but we might have this kind of much more open sort of sense of just how interdependent we are upon a range of other things. So we begin to reconceive our boundaries a bit.
Hello, good morning. Thank you again for the talk. My question has to do with, there's an artist I'm a very big fan of. Her name is Janelle Monáe. And so she believes in having this idea where she does not refer to herself as being man or woman, but instead refers to herself as being an android and other. So my question is, is it a viable theory that we are now no longer a person or a being inside one category, but can post-humanist desire manifest itself in a way where we no longer desire to be described as humans, but instead of an other being?
I think that has a range of answers. I think there are a few possibilities here in light of answering that. The question of whether someone has this kind of ability to self-name has a potential to be a very humanist practice, in fact, in a certain sort of sense. So the idea of saying, I am X, I am Y, I categorize myself, even if you categorize yourself quite broadly across, has a tendency still to remain in a logic in which the individual human is all-powerful in determining their subjectivity in a rather transcendent sort of fashion. So I think the possibility of doing that self-naming activity is slightly at odds with the desire that's obviously being expressed by that. However, whether or not we are at a stage, whether or not we will start to begin to see ourselves as being much more mutable in terms of understanding where we might sit, and that in different sorts of places, in different sorts of times, and over and across a range of moments in any given life experience, we might very easily adapt to momentary crystallization and understanding of ourselves in that environment as android, male. I think that flexibility and fluidity is beginning to be emergent, and is something that the post-human precisely picks up. The idea that you don't have this sort of identity which sits crystallized and kind of moves somehow through all sorts of experiences but remains kind of intact, but actually that whole notion is a series and a process of identifications in which you might have an intersectional and conglomerate notion of what a self might be at any given moment. So I am a little wary of the self-naming, I am now this, and I know that for sure, but I'm not wary of the boundary thing in relation to a post-humanist sensibility. I think that's probably precisely the kind of thing it begins to allow for.
Only 3 minutes left, so should we just allow 2 more questions here, including your question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So just I love Janelle Monáe too, actually. She's one of my favorites. So actually, this goes back to what I was kind of attempting to ask, right? So there are some people in the world who move through the world and actually have to deal with a very specific way of being, right? Like of looking. And so how does post-humanism, so I'm in an Afrofuturism show in New York right now, and everybody's African American. Right, and so there is a project of self-naming, and the reason people self-name is because others are always naming them. So how does that work in post-humanism? Like, how can one go from a world where we are what we are and are named by the outside world to be that thing, and even though we strive to become, the world is constantly reinforcing what we are. So how does that function in post-humanism? Because humanism is necessary to allow for us becoming what we want to be within the context of humanism. So if we give up humanism, what happens? It's like very scary, actually.
I know. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I wouldn't want this to be read as an idea that this is what I meant when I said I didn't think there was a kind of ethics of radical relativism involved in this, and so on and so forth, where it's all just a matter of anything goes and it's all fluid and whatever. No, there's a whole host of quite serious and quite important differences that are drawn between people, which allow them access or don't allow them access, allow them power or don't allow them power, and biopower is part and parcel of that. So this whole idea of even the genome allows for certain power distributions, and it's iniquitous and so forth. So I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that we are getting rid of subjectivity, for example, or the possibility that we understand the subject. I'm suggesting at all, or the idea of naming projects, or the idea of self-naming projects across a range of different forms. The phrase that's commonly used for that is strategic essentialism, and it's a really good phrase. I.e., I don't think that I am one thing fixed. But in this particular position, I am going to absolutely name and occupy that position with others occupying that position strategically. So we're going to take a strategic essentialist moment. It doesn't mean you actually conceive that you are absolutely 100% forever fixed into that. You don't have to have an underlying belief that you will of a teleological becoming, that you can now know what you would want to become a year from now, 20 years from now, whatever, or even how unbelievably different it might be in terms of its naming or its understanding or its intelligibility X number of years in the future and so forth. So that there's no fixity. So it's not essentialism as in there is an essence and you are this and you name it, but there's a really important moment for a strategic essentialism. It's just that it might allow the conglomeration and people to say, African American and naming here and acting in this way, but at the same time every single individual in that being able to rename in something else. Women, transhuman, in all different sorts of ways. So there's a mobile positioning in relation to that. So no, this doesn't get rid of, and I don't have any sense of I think there's a lot of critical work to be done about moving beyond a certain kind of logic of humanist transcendent representation logic towards something that is much more about articulation and multiplicity and so forth. But I do not think that gets rid of the power politics that underlie the things that we must kind of work toward on a regular and strategic basis. And I would never suggest it's some kind of universal panacea, or we can all just go into the virtual and all be kind of ungendered, whatever. I totally agree that there's a real importance for being able to occupy a position. And yeah, so I understand your reticence.
Because we actually are 1 or 2 minutes over the time. But if you still have any questions, shall we just leave you to discuss during the tea break? Right, we are going to have 10 minutes tea break, so shall we all come back in 10 minutes, 10 to 11, 10:50. Right, thank you very much again, Professor Marcia Miskinen.